This is actually an old paper from 2014. I'm going to record it here basically because it has some good points, plus I'm building a story on the history of 2 degrees C global warming target, and then how 1.5 came about and what role IPCC is actually playing. It's a boundary organization between science and politics, social society, economics. It is mostly negotiating with the nation states and not other players in the global warming game like industry corporations and so on, and it's also not negotiating at subnational levels. So, and yet in the Anthropocene, considering humans are now basically an integral part of environmental change, that we are in fact the largest agent of change now, can we just focus on global warming targets and emissions reductions without worrying about the social heart, as it's referred to here, that lies at the center of global environmental change? Not only in terms of reducing our impacts, but also looking at the impact of trying to reduce our impact on the distribution of the outcomes. For example, geoengineering or the emissions pathways. How do they affect the people who are actually not the biggest contributors? It's a cyclone day. Cyclone Biparjoy is going to hit in a few hours. It's very warm in Mumbai. I'm still living without the AC, so I have the window open. It's windy, so maybe there is a little bit of noise. I'll see how bad it is to make sure that the quality of the recording is fine. So this is a commentary from Nature Climate Change way back in 2014. Susie Moser, some of you may know, is a very well-speaking social scientist who works on these sorts of issues. The social heart of global environmental change. The environmental challenges that confront society are unprecedented and staggering in their scope, pace and complexity. Unless we reframe and examine them through a social lens, societal responses will be too little, too late, and potentially blind to negative consequences. Since the paper was written, this is when the AR5 was being released. AR6 has since been released. During the AR5 there were the representative concentration pathways, which were different from the earlier pathways used for making projections. In RCP 8.5, future pathways, technological innovations were included, so there was an implicit transition from just assessing climate change and climate impacts to providing future pathways that depended on technical feasibilities, and they were somehow co-produced with politicians or politics. So is it a good thing? We'll discuss that separately. So the other thing to remember is, since 2014, now almost 10 years later, despite all the negotiations and the incredibly optimistic pathways for the future of keeping global warming below 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C, the global emissions are still not really bending. So it's still going as if we are in the business as usual scenarios, and nationally determined contributions, the voluntary submissions of plans to reduce emissions by countries, have been revised, and still we know that they are not enough to stay within 2 degrees C, let alone 1.5 degrees C. Keeping all that in mind, we still have to worry about the fact that societies are involved in the consequences of what we do. So framing is a main focus here. Framing is where you take a problem and you literally frame it, and that brings focus to action needed to define strategies based on the goals we are trying to accomplish, and then look for implementation tactics, and then also have monitoring, verification and reporting steps in ensuring that we are on the pathways. To read some of the text, of course, framing is not the only thing that needs to change to get people's attention and motivate action, which is desperately needed at this point. But we believe an essential ingredient for success would be to reframe the issues at stake in terms that put humans at the center of global environmental change, for 3 fundamental reasons. First, we can no longer disentangle societal, social and environmental systems and problems. This is clear. We are the cause and we are trying to solve the problem. They are inseparable in this sense. Secondly, in the Anthropocene, humans are fundamentally and massively altering, I am having trouble reading today, massively altering the Earth from the state it was in just a few centuries ago. A remarkable and unprecedented condition of human existence that came with Industrial Revolution, the technological innovations, and life got better, but we created all this problem, unintended consequences. And thirdly, in response to the challenges before us, society will have to either deliberately seek out or be involuntarily subjected to profound societal transformations. Of course, here global warming is already creating winners and losers. I hear some wind, so I'll check the recording. But who gets involuntarily subjected to profound societal transformation, of course, depends on agency. People, global south typically, which has not contributed as much to the I have a phone call. Sorry, I have to pause it here. Sorry about that. So the profound changes that are going to be experienced are mostly going to be by the poor, who haven't majorly contributed to the problem in the first place. Keeping all this in mind, let's read some of the concise messages that is taken from a much longer report here on the transformative cornerstones framework, 6 social frames for global environmental change. Cornerstone 1, I think maybe I should stop and re-record it. Historical and contextual complexity. What are the interconnected drivers of global change? What are the historical trajectories that have led to the current situation? What are the interdependencies of people's vulnerabilities to these and other social processes? And how do risks, impacts, perceptions, experiences, and responses differ across the world, across social classes, gender, race, or faith, and between personal or professional identities? Right? So I'm a climate scientist and I have a personal life. How do personal and professional identities matter? Cornerstone 2, consequences. What are the current and future threats from global environmental change and their impacts on people and communities? What are the diverse realities of living with such change? Cornerstone 3, conditions and visions for change. How does social change at the individual and collective levels happen, and what directions might it take? Right? We need to have a vision for change, or hopefully optimistic vision of the future. Otherwise, we are going to, create climate anxiety, which is already a big problem for many of the youngsters, for example. Strong wind there. What kind of leadership and other capacities are required for successful change to occur? Socio-technical transformations don't just depend on exciting innovations, but assimilation and adaptation of new technologies is always a challenging issue. Cornerstone 4, especially if they require behavioral change. Interpretation and subjective sense making is cornerstone 4. What are the values, beliefs, interests, worldviews, hopes, needs, and desires that underlie people's experiences of and responses or lack thereof to global change? What shapes the personal narratives and social discourses about the nature of the world and the environment, and thus people's views on the necessity for transformation? There is the so-called post-truth era now, where facts often don't matter because alternative narratives are created with false equivalents of expertise from climate deniers and so on. So how do people actually perceive the necessity for a transformation at all? Cornerstone 5, responsibilities and ethics. What does it take to foster global and intergenerational solidarity and justice? What are the obligations, duties, and responsibilities to poor and vulnerable people, to future generations, and to the other than human environment? So when we are pushing so hard for mitigation based on global warming targets, do they ensure climate justice, equity, gender balance, impacts shared equitably in some sense, or does it just mow over people and force them to live with the consequences that may come along with the mitigation goals, which are often based on technical feasibilities and economic optimality of some sort, cost benefit analysis, and so on. So who's defining these things when it comes to responsibilities and ethics? And how do we worry about biodiversity, other species, and so on in doing our mitigation and accounting for future trajectories of climate? Finally, cornerstone 6, governance and decision making. How are decisions made in the face of uncertainty? What pathways are available for influencing policy making? What determines the success or failure of political agreements? What drives political will? Okay, so these are the transformative cornerstones framework steps. So these are the 6 social frames for global environmental change. And there are many lessons learned since this paper was published in terms of the pandemic and now the Russian war, how humanity responds to crises at either global scales like the pandemic or local scales that cascades into the global system through energy markets. For example, invasion of Ukraine by Russia has perturbed the energy systems, energy markets, and the system has responded in a certain way, with US and Norway fulfilling the gaps to supply gas to the Europeans and making a lot of money. Europeans may be reconsidering their own climate goals, promises, future steps. Of course, there are many positive steps as well in terms of investments in renewables. COVID brought us vaccines, but then the example of China and the zero COVID policy and how it handled its own people, and the protests that followed and that led to the removal of zero COVID policy. These are kind of the examples that we can expect as climate crisis, as it is called, itself plays out and the impacts begin to be manifest disparately across societal classes and so on. Okay, so I just wanted to include it because it has some good messages that still is very relevant, even though the paper itself is dated by now back to 2014. Okay, let me leave it here and then we'll come back and discuss other issues as we go along.